Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum ji. We are here with another episode of this very interesting series that we're doing from the platform of Ghamidi Center of Islamic Learning. We're talking about things that I believe are extremely important for people to know whether they are Muslims or they're non-Muslims. We're going to be talking about the fact that why should anybody choose to see revealed religion over other religions when it comes to knowing about what matters of God. Then we're going to be talking about that within the framework of revealed religions, why to check out Quran or Islam. Then we're going to be talking about the most important part of this series, that what kind of a book is the Quran in the first place and how should one go on reading it. And then we're going to talk about the basic teachings of the Quran, and then finally some misconceptions about the Quran. So it's a very, very important series. And to discuss this, as usual, I have with me very accomplished Quranic scholar, Dr. Shehzad Saleem Saab. Thank you so much, Shehzad Bhai, for giving us your time.
It's my pleasure.
In the previous episode, as I told the audiences, we talked about why should anybody choose to see revealed religions over other ideologies in matters of God. And then we talked about the fact that within the framework of revealed religions, why to check out Islam and Quran. Today we're going to talk about, I think, the most important part of our discussion, which is that when we come to the Quran, what exactly is the Quran? What is the factual introduction of the Quran? And how should one go on about reading it? Before I take your take on this, I would want the audiences to know that probably this is the most important aspect of Islam, but ironically, it's the least talked about aspect of Islam. When we talk about the Quran, even within Muslims, a very generic, general introduction is given. It's the guidance from God, it's the word of God. But what it is factually is not told to us specifically. And I believe that the miracle of the Quran actually lies within the introduction of the Quran. So, sir, over to you. What's your take on the fact that what is the Quran factually and how should one go about reading it? Ji, sir.
This is indeed a very, very interesting question and a very pertinent one. And for any person who'd like to start off reading the Quran, this is perhaps the most important question. And this is especially so because you see, before you even start reading the Quran, you have so many preconceived notions about the book of God. And one of those preconceived notions is that it's a book from the other side of the world, which of course it is. And people supposedly think that it contains every knowledge or every discipline of knowledge, and it guides mankind on every single issue that would arise. Unfortunately, according to my understanding, this is not the case. Because as discussed in our previous episode as well, a very large portion of guidance is found within mankind's and within our own nature. So our own nature, our intellect, our own conscience, they guide us on most occasions. But of course, there are certain other areas in which divine guidance complements this innate guidance. And as such, this guidance has two components, I would say. One of these components is that it reminds people of the guidance they already have in their own nature, in their own conscience, and after applying their own intellect. So one portion of the Quran deals with facts or with things which need reminders. Thus, for example, universal truths, they need reminders. The fact that we have to be answerable to God. It's going to be a day of accountability one day for each one of us. So all of these things we do sort of get to, and we can gauge through our innate quest for the truth. But as I said, there are pieces which need to be filled in order to make this jigsaw puzzle a complete whole. And it is here that the Almighty has revealed the Quran. And before the Quran, we have so many revealed scriptures. So the important thing here is to realize that the Quran is basically God's speech, and it is in the form of an oration, or if I put it another way, it is a book of dialogues. And the foremost addressees of this book of dialogues are the people who lived in the land of Arabia in the times of the Prophet Muhammad. So this is something which was pointed out by one of the greatest luminaries of the subcontinent vis-a-vis Quranic studies and Quranic understanding. And his name, I think I did point out earlier on, is Hamiduddin Farahi. He died about 100 years ago, and it was his prescription and his diagnosis regarding the genre of the Quran, which is so very important to understand the type of guidance which the Quran provides. So the question is it a book of history? Is it a book of scripture? Is it a book of general guidance? Is it in the form of prose? Is it in the form of poetry? Or what exactly is the genre of the Quran? So Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, in his discourses, has explained that the best, perhaps, analogy that can be drawn vis-a-vis human works is that the Quran is a book of dialogues. It's a living dialogue between the Almighty and the people who were present in the times of Prophet Muhammad. And as such, it's a dialogue in the speech of God. Of course, the narration itself is from the Almighty, but it is as if the speakers change and the spoken to also change. So the addressees and the addresser, they keep on changing. So typically, at times, the Almighty would be speaking to the groups who were present in the times of Prophet Muhammad, and they can be actually divided into three broad groups. So one of them were the hypocrites, which were mostly found in Medina. The other ones are the idolaters of Mecca, which of course were found in Mecca. And thirdly, we had the people of the book. So it's like the Quran, like a divine orator, addressing these various groups in their capacities, going right and left, as if multiple addressees are standing right before us. Like, for example, in a classroom, when a teacher delivers his speech or he conducts a class, he has a number of students right before him. And the teacher keeps on shuffling back and forth, talking to one individual according to his or her own beliefs or the issues that he or she would face. So similarly, the Quran is like a divine sermonizer. It would talk to various groups who were present in those times. And this speech, of course, is something which has been eternally preserved, as you just pointed out. And this preservation is something which has taken the form of a dialogue. So we have, just as, if I just may point out, in our worldly domain, for example, we have the dialogues of Plato. Or in Persian, we have the Javed Nama of Iqbal. So if you study these works, you'll find out that, like books of dialogues, there is a speaker and there is a spoken to. At times, there is a monologue. At times, there is a group of people to whom one speaker is talking to. So in a very similar vein, in a very similar, I would say, capacity, each surah of the Quran has an addressee. And that addressee is the basic addressee. And the speaker and the spoken to, at times, they keep on changing. And in most cases, in the Meccan surahs, the addressees are the idolaters. In the Medinan surahs, they are the hypocrites and the people of the book. But this is a slightly oversimplification. It doesn't mean that these entities are not discussed elsewhere or otherwise. So it's of paramount importance to realize that the foremost addressees of the Quran, or the foremost addressees of God, are basically people, and they are real people, living entities who are present in 7th century Arabia. And this dialogue is taking place between these entities. And you know what? The interesting phenomena here is that, of course, people think that, well, if this is the kind of the book, then one thing then can be easily gauged. And that is that if it's sort of a universal book and it deals with so many religions, then why is it that two major religions are absent, totally absent, from discussion in the Quran? Buddhism and Hinduism, of course, both of them were present at that time. So we know that the reason here is that none of the people of Arabia were either Buddhists or Hindus. So you will not find Buddhism or Hinduism discussed, precisely for the reason that this discussion in the Book of God was between living entities who were present in the Arabian Peninsula. And outside the Arabian Peninsula, whatever was going on, of course, was not the concern at that time. Now, the question that arises is that if this is the case, that the Quran is a very sort of a localized book, it speaks to individuals who are present in 7th century Arabia, then the next question, if you would like to ask, and you can, of course, take that up as well, is how is that relevant to us? Because you see, once the Book of God is revealed to people, or it talks about people who were present in 7th century Arabia, then it does seem that, well, if this is the case, then how is it that we figure in this book of God, and how is it that we maybe receive guidance or get connected to God? So unless, I mean, I can go on and explain that, but coming back to my original point, that unless this genre of the Quran, this classification of the Quran as a book of dialogues is understood, a lot of things that come to our mind vis-a-vis what's happening in the Quran and why is it that we find so many things that might not relate to us. For example, the Bani Israel or the idolaters, and you'll find that almost 2/3 of the Quran is discussing polytheism. And today, I mean, there's such profound era of monotheism that we encounter today, that one seldom thinks that why exactly are the polytheists discussed to such an extent that it does seem that monotheism, and this is especially the case with Abrahamic religions. But outside those Abrahamic religions, as I said, it does it does raise this question that how does it become relevant to such people? So if we understand that the Quran basically is a book of dialogue, its genre is a book of oration in which there are orations as separate surahs, and in which the Almighty is speaking to characters, and those characters are speaking amongst themselves as well. And we even have Satan figuring as one of the characters. We have prophets of God figuring there. We have Gabriel delivering the sermon of God and at times addressing prophets. So if we summarize, we'll find the Almighty there, we'll find the hypocrites, we'll find the people of the book, we'll find the idolaters of Arabia, we'll find the Muslims themselves, we'll find angels and some of the other entities which occur in a very fragmentary way. But this is how we should imagine that the Quran is a book of conversation between people who are living there. And when I say it's a book of conversation, then as we discussed last time, there is a specific law regarding the people who are discussed there, and which does not relate to the rest of mankind, which you just referred to in your opening speech, that of course there is something which is specific in this nature and that cannot be extended to. But just to cut the long story short, I would just say that unless this genre or this style of the Quran is not appreciated, that it's a book of dialogues, that those dialogues which took place between people who were living in the 7th century Arabia, a lot of its guidance will either be wrongly applied to us because there are certain things which are specific to the addressees of the prophets of God, which cannot be extended beyond them. Or what we will do is that we will completely localize the Quran. So on the one hand, we might end up saying, well, this is a book which only belongs to Arabia, and we cannot extend it to other entities. And on the other hand, we might end up extending certain specific directives which are meant for God's messengers to later times. So these are the two things which might result, or two mistakes, I would say, or two misreadings of the divine book, unless we have this very clear picture that it is a book of dialogue between specific entities.
Okay, perfect. I think this was a very, very summarized yet very accurate description of what the Quran actually is. But before I move forward, Shehzad bhai, to the point that how is Quran a book revealed 1400 years ago, more than 1400 years ago, how is that relevant to us today? Before I move on to that topic, I want to shed some more light with you on the very miraculous part of the Quran, which is, as we discussed in the previous episode, God's judgment on earth, preserved record of how God conducted his judgment on earth for the last time through Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I want to speak a little bit more on that and then take your take on it, because I believe that is the most miraculous part of the Quran. That is the most persuasive point as far as Quran being literally the divine speech. And that is actually miraculous also in a way that we have audio recording of God preserved on a piece of paper in writing. I just want to give a summarized background of it. Like, what is the Quran? Quran is basically, in its claim, the following, that a man came in Arabia, which is the backwaters of the world, more than 1445 years ago, with no background in politics, military, or poetry, and that man came with a claim that he has been contacted by God. Now, what this God has been doing throughout mankind's history is that it has been directly intervening in the affairs of humanity throughout the world, throughout our history, for two purposes. One, to give guidance to people. But the second purpose, and I think that is more important, is to give humanity the most conclusive proof of the judgment day to come after we die in this world. That proof being worldly demonstration of this God's judgment here on earth to nations through individuals called Rasuls. Now, Muhammad claimed to be the last of the Rasuls, the last man who the divine got in touch with to guide mankind and to do the worldly demonstration of his judgment on earth. Now, in the 23 years that followed that initial claim, this God kept contacting Muhammad and directing every affair, every decision that he took. And Quran is, as you said, as you rightly pointed out, the preserved speech of this God on paper. So, we exactly now know today what this God spoke to, let's suppose, the idolaters of Mecca, what this God spoke to the Christians and Jews of Mecca, what this God said about good deeds, what this God said about my purpose, what this God said to, let's say, generally humanity. We know exactly what this God said. How important is it that, number one, the miraculous nature that this claim and how this claim got fulfilled in 23 years, and we have the preserved record of exactly how things happened. This is not something that is left to history, let's say. This is not something that is left to conjectures. This is exact record of how things unfolded. How much does it add to the miraculousness of the Quran and to the claim that it's divine? And how important is this record that we have in the form of Quran from this perspective?
So you see, I usually discuss this question in a slightly historical sequence, so that certain things become perhaps more clear if we adopt this historical approach. So I divide the religious history of mankind into two broad periods. So one of them is from Adam to Prophet Muhammad, and this I call the prophetic period, simply because prophets of God, messengers of God would come in this period, and they would be assigned a certain task, which I'm just going to discuss, and then they would go away, and the last of these messengers was Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then we have the post-prophetic period, or the post-prophetic era, which would last from Prophet Muhammad's demise right until the Day of Judgment. So the religious history of mankind is divided into the prophetic era, in which prophets of God and specifically his messengers would come, and in the post-prophetic era, of course, is no such interaction. So what happens is that the Quran is a book which belongs to the prophetic era. It was revealed to the last prophet of God, Prophet Muhammad, and therefore it preserves the biography of Prophet Muhammad the way we today now know as his trait as a messenger of God. So this prophetic era has a very specific trait which is preserved in the Quran, and which, as you just rightly pointed out, is the actual miracle of God, vis-a-vis the fact that the Almighty in this prophetic era set up lesser days of judgment, the smaller days of judgment in the time of every messenger of God, and he made people pass through this judgment. And for this, he actually sent his messengers, and through his own divine scheme, these messengers would deliver the truth, they would communicate the truth, and people who would intentionally, not out of any mistake, not out of any misinformation, but in spite of being convinced that this is the truth, they ended up denying it. It was a deliberate denial. It was an intentional denial. The Almighty punished these nations of messengers of God who did so. And this is that specific, I would say, the specific trait of this prophetic era. And when I say the Quran is a book of dialogues, and we just discussed that in our previous question, it is basically this thing that needs to be understood, that this dialogue took place in 7th century Arabia for the last time, when Prophet Muhammad communicated the truth, what the truth is, on behalf of the Almighty, and he delivered it conclusively. And once that conclusive communication had been done, and in spite of that conclusive communication, people ended up denying it out of arrogance, out of vested interests, out of various other reasons. The Almighty punished them, and this punishment took the forms of either natural disasters, which took place, of course, in the times of the previous prophets. However, in the case of Prophet Muhammad, we know that almost all of his people the Quraysh, they accepted faith, barring a few ones, and the active opponents had already been put to death in some of the wars that were conducted. But by and large, almost all of the adversaries of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they accepted faith amongst his own nation. Then there were the Jews and the Christians, of course, who, in the later part of the Prophet Muhammad's campaign, upon them this judgment was also implemented. But for them, the nature of this judgment was slightly different. So before I explain the nature of his judgment, just once again coming back to the question that basically in this era, this prophetic era, divine punishment took place in the times of each of these messengers of God. And the purpose of this divine punishment was to remind people living in the post-prophetic era, people like us, that, well, look at these people in the times of the prophetic era. Each of them met their fate. Nations of God met their fate. And you must not forget that the same fate is going to be met by you if you deny, or out of any ignorance or any other reason, you are not up to the mark regarding God's guidance. But the only thing is that your punishment has been deferred to the day of judgment. So basically, the accountability which is going to take place on the day of judgment, which we often forget, for this particular reason, the Almighty preserved those lesser days of judgment as a record in the Quran. And the last time that this judgment was delivered was in the times of Prophet Muhammad, when, of course, there was no need to punish people of his own nation because, as I said, they accepted faith. And this whole exercise, or this whole saga, was preserved in the Quran, and it became a miracle in the fact that when the Prophet Muhammad actually declared his prophethood, when he said that this would happen, that God's judgment is going to be implemented in his own lifetime, he was a non-entity virtually. I mean, non-entity not in the fact that people did not recognize him as a prophet of God, but non-entity as far as any material support was concerned. I mean, he didn't have any backing. He was all alone. Very few people had accepted faith. But right on that occasion, when few people were with him, he claimed that he is a messenger of God, and for the last time, the judgment of God is going to be implemented, and that judgment actually took place. Now, the important thing that needs to be understood from here is that these dialogues, or these speeches which took place between the Almighty and the various denominations, they resulted in this divine court of justice being set up. And the thing that we often end up confusing with, or maybe wrongly deducing with, is that what happens is that this particular divine judgment is something which is specific to the messengers of God. And it can only be conducted in the lifetime of a messenger of God. But you see, out of, I would say, erroneous understanding, people think that since the Almighty has told us in the Quran that لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, that the model set by the Prophet, or the exemplary personality of the Prophet, has to be followed by the believers. So when they saw that this divine punishment or this divine scheme was in play, in vogue in the times of Prophet Muhammad, they thought that because he's an example for every one of us, so in our times also, or in other words, in the post-prophetic era also, we should do the same exercise. So today, a lot of religious groups, or extremist groups, I would say, when they have this plan of globally conquering this world, or they have this plan of killing non-Muslims, they basically derive their own thesis from those verses of the Quran, which was specifically meant for messengers of God. And for these messengers also, as I said, it was not that these messengers were doing something out of their own selves as world conquerors, or maybe they had their own ambition. It was a divine scheme which they implemented on behalf of God. So they were like instruments of God's justice. And once those messengers passed away, the law, of course, cannot be invoked. But unfortunately, because of this understanding that the Prophet has to be followed in every sphere, people continued at various instances of time. And today, we find a lot of religious groups, like, for example, the Taliban or the TLP or people like them, who do think that they have to follow the example of the Prophet, and the way he punished, or the way he was called upon to punish his adversaries, they too have this job beforehand. So I would say that as a result of not understanding this divine scheme of God and this aspect of the book of God, that is a book of dialogues, they have ended up extending a certain divine law which was purely meant for messengers of God for their own selves. And I do think that it's a sincere mistake on their part, and it needs to be rectified as soon as possible, and it can only be possibly made to rectify. If we discuss this aspect of the Quran more and more and tell them that how the Quran has said one thing repeatedly, and that is min ba'di ma tabayyana lahumul haq, which is a Quranic verse which occurs in various forms in the Quran, which says that these are the people who denied the truth after it became evident to them. And how did it become evident to them? It was the Almighty who was telling his respective messenger, well, look, these are the people with whom enough is enough. You have delivered the truth, and if they're not accepting it, it's not because you are falling short. It's because they have now taken up intentional denial. So only the Almighty could have divulged this intentional denial, because you see, this is a matter of the heart, and we cannot judge whether a person is intentionally denying or not. However, in the post-prophetic era, since the Almighty does not communicate with us like He used to do in the times of the messengers of God, we simply cannot know whether a particular group is intentionally denying, deliberately denying, or it's merely out of some confusion or lack of information. So you see, this is the most important part that we need to realize, that in the prophetic era, this information was exposed by the Almighty to His messengers, and then they implemented punishment of God. Today, neither we have a messenger amongst us, and neither is it possible, nor is the Almighty going to communicate with us and tell us, well, look at these people, or these Jews and Christians, or such and such people. They know what the truth is, but they are still denying. Because, as I said, this denial can only be communicated by the Almighty. And after the termination of the institution of prophethood, this cannot take place. Hence, any extension that we make regarding this law and try to apply it to current circumstances would be an enormous misreading, a huge misreading of the divine practice.
Very nicely put, Shehzad Bhai. Again, God's practical demonstration of His judgment here on earth that happened for the last time through Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and that judgment, the punishment and the reward, is very specific to the addressees of the messenger of God while he is present in the world. That punishment, that judgment does not continue after the prophet of God has left the world. Because here comes our point that we wanted to share before, that how is Quran relevant to us today? Because as far as I have been able to see, Quran has two parts. One is the part which is specific to the Prophet, specific to Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's lifetime, which is again the judgment part. The judgment of God is specific again only to the addressees of the messenger of God. It's also a very important point, just as a side note, because yes, Muslims, there have been organizations within Muslims who have contended that no, it's not specific to the lifetime of the messenger. The order of God to fight, to establish God's religion on earth will continue till the day of judgment. So it's very important that no, that is absolutely not the case. I think Muslims are only allowed to fight in self-defense or against persecution or zulm, but fighting for the sake of establishing religion or fighting for religion, that ended right after Prophet ﷺ was gone. That is not relevant to us today. So how do we distinguish between what is relevant to us today and what was only specific to Prophet ﷺ, the messenger of God? And how is the Quran relevant for, let's say, somebody today, whether it be in any country of the world? And that also will determine how should one read Quran. Like here in this section, if you could also shed some light on the fact that if I am to read Quran as somebody who has no knowledge about the background of Islam or Quran in the first place, how should I approach the Quran? Ji.
You see, as you rightly just said, that if we have this background which we just discussed, that the Quran has the Quran has two components. One is the component which is specific to the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad, which of course is that component in which the worldly judgment was established on the face of this earth for the last time. And this component is something that cannot be extended beyond Prophet Muhammad's own lifetime. And then we have the other component, which is general guidance, or what we call the Sharia, which is for all times to come. So this is how we make this distinction, that about those directives for which it is essential that a messenger of God has to be present. And he is basically an instrument of God's justice on this earth. and implementing the punishment of God on those who deny the message of God in spite of being convinced about it in their hearts. So that particular component of the Quran can be easily, I think, separated from the rest by simply thinking that the directives or the harsh directives, if I just put them in inverted commas, that harsh directives or stern directives of the Quran, which, for example, take us by surprise at times, that, for example, killing of non-Muslims, beheading them, or not making friends with them, or not being congenial to them. And similarly, besides the Quran, we have hadiths telling us that we should not say salam to them, or we should not inherit the legacy from a non-Muslim, and vice versa. So these are some of the directives which are mentioned in the Quran, and which do cause this consternation in us, that why is it that the Almighty is so harsh on certain people? So if we sort of sift through the Quran and single out these directives, we'll find that all of them relate to the divine judgment of God, which took place in the times of Prophet Muhammad for the last time. And all these manifestations, which speak sternly regarding people who don't believe, are basically various forms of punishment, which the Almighty implemented through his messengers of God. As I said, in the times of the last messenger, Prophet Muhammad, this punishment never took place for his own nation or his own people, because they had accepted faith. But to give you examples of the previous nations, you'll find that if you study all these history details regarding the various forms of punishment, that as far as the idolaters are concerned, or people who intentionally do polytheism, they are convinced that there is one God, but in spite of that, they think that there are other deities as well to be worshipped. For them, the Almighty says that their punishment is death. Idolatry is to be punished by death. And this is exactly the same thing which the Quran has said at other places, that everything will be forgiven by God, or can be forgiven by God, except shirk or polytheism if it is done intentionally. So for that particular punishment, or for that particular crime, the punishment is death, or the capital punishment. And for all the rest, or the other denominations which did not indulge in polytheism, and they were basically monotheists, although they indulged in various forms of polytheism, but primarily they were monotheists, like the people of the book. For them, it was basically subjugation. They were not allowed to live in a way that they would rule. They would be allowed to live as subservient, and they would be asked to pay the jizya tax. So for these people or these denominations, the nature of punishment was different. For the people of the book, it was basically subjugation and subservience. For the idolaters, it was the capital punishment. But as you can see, the idolaters in the times of Prophet Muhammad, all of them, except the few who were the active opponents and who were already taken care of in some of the battles, the rest accepted faith. So this is how the first part of the Quran, the judgment part, tells us that as far as the stern directives are concerned, you can see that they are the ones in which, if you are killing people for the sake of their apostasy, maybe they're turning against the Prophet after accepting the religion of Islam, or disbelief, which we call kufr, or polytheism, which we call shirk. So these three crimes are something which cannot be punished by the state. So shirk, kufr, and irtidad in the Arabic language, which would mean polytheism, disbelief, and apostasy. These are the three crimes which can only be punished by the Almighty, and which he did punish in the times of Prophet Muhammad, but they cannot be punished after the departure of the messengers of God by the state in any way. And for all those people who you think are disbelievers, or they have turned against, or they have left the folds of Islam, or, for example, they are mushrikun or the polytheists, there is absolutely no punishment in the post-prophetic era. They are allowed to live however they would please to live. For us, our relations with them have to be congenial, they have to be friendly, they have to be in a way that we are able to communicate what we think is the truth. So this is how we distinguish the judgment in the judgment part of the Quran. Now, as far as the other part we were discussing, which relates to each and every one of us, which we just discussed before this question, is that this guidance part is again composed of two things. One is what we call the Sharia, or the Divine Directives, which all of us need, for example, in the political sphere, in the economic sphere, in the social sphere, in the penal affair, and some of the other affairs. So it is here that the Quran gives very, very to the point directives. A couple of them, maybe three or four of them regarding the Sharia of political affair, a couple of them regarding the economics affair. So the Sharia is one component of the guidance. And the second component, which I just mentioned, of course, is the reminder part, in which the Almighty, the verses of the Quran, they remind us of the innate guidance that we have in us. And of course, the other all-important component of that divine guidance, which is called Al-Hikmah. Al-Hikmah means the aspect of believing in various entities, like, for example, believing in God, believing in the last day, believing in the prophets of God, believing in the angels, the books of God, etc. So as far as the rest of the guidance is concerned, which is besides the judgment guidance, which we just separated, we have these two components of religion. One is faith and morality, and the other one is Sharia. So faith and morality, as the name itself signifies, are things which relate to faith and morality. So this is one component. And the other component is the Sharia, which I just singled out as the fact that there are Sharia directives which are given to mankind. And as a third component, we can add that these moral directives basically are ones which are not given by the Quran, because we already know them from our innate guidance. All it does is it keeps on reminding us of the fact that, yes, we have to be individuals who conform to certain moral standards. So I think that if this is taken care of, that polytheism, disbelief, and apostasy, that these three things and all the things related to them, they are separated out and they are thought of as God's judgment package, if I use this word. So we can in no way tamper with that. That is specifically related to the messengers of God. And the rest of them, the rest of the Quran, it deals with the Sharia and the Hikmah. And the Hikmah, of course, is faith and morality. The Sharia are divine directives which deal with our social, political, economic, and penal affairs.
So, in a summarized way, it would be accurate to say that all the parts within the Quran which deal with fighting others for the sake of establishing religion, all the parts of the Quran which deal with waging war against other people for the sake of establishing religion or punishing people on matters of faith, all of these verses are basically specific to the addressees of the Rasul or the addressees of the Messenger, and other parts which deal with guidance of mankind, warning mankind of the judgment day to come, telling us about our purpose, details of what's right and wrong, those parts deal with entire mankind. So in a nutshell, is it right to say that God's judgment was limited to the addressees of the Messenger, yet, and that is the case with all messengers, with Prophet Jesus, Prophet Moses, Noah, Lot, Abraham, everybody that God mentions in the Quran. The judgment part was very specific for the addressees, immediate addressees of the Rasul, yet the guidance is for all mankind for all times. Would it be accurate to say that?
Yes. One more thing, that the judgment itself is something which provides us with guidance. So you see, if we divide the Quran into two components, one is the judgment part and the other one is the general guidance part. So even the judgment part, although it is specific to the addressees of messengers of God, it has a message for all of us, and that is accountability is something which none of us is going to miss. All of us are going to face that accountability. So that judgment was the accountability which took place for the addressees of messengers of God. If in the post-prophetic era it is not taking place for us, we should not be misled. Our accountability is going to take place in the hereafter because of the fact that the accountability which took place in the times of the messengers of God, it shows that Almighty is not going to let us go without holding us accountable. So you see, even the judgment part has this relevance to us, and that is what is very important to the Book of God. It keeps on reminding us, and as you said, it's like a visual which has been preserved in the Quran. When the previous nations were destroyed, like the nations of Ad, the Samud, people of Lot, the people of Abraham. So it's like recording the fact that, look, these people were held accountable. Although you cannot hold people accountable now, because this is only the prerogative of messengers of God, but the message that you can draw from this is that your accountability is going to take place as well. Maybe not in this world, but yes, definitely in the hereafter. So even the judgment part has a lot of relevance. And this is where we need to understand that the major portion of the Quran which deals with this judgment and the details of this judgment, they cannot be taken and implemented by us per se. Yes, what we can do is we can draw a lesson by analogy that this accountability which took place for these nations is going to take place for us as well. And this would make the Quran a book of guidance, which not only guides us in that guidance portion in which we have the morality, faith, and Sharia, but also in the judgment part, telling us that, well, look here, don't think that you'll go scot-free. You'll be held accountable. And look what God did to these nations. If he did them with them, he'll do it with you as well. The only thing is, it is deferred.
Okay, perfect. Here, on a very side note, because I know, Shehzad Bhai, a lot of our viewers will have this question at this point in time, that why does Quran only mention people in the Middle East as far as prophets are concerned or his judgment is concerned?
Right.
It's also been told in the Quran. As a side note, I just want to share it, that God says that I'm telling you about prophets who you know about. He's talking to his immediate addressees of Arabia. He's telling them that I'm mentioning these names, Noah, Abraham, Lot, Moses, Jesus, because you know about them. The same God says that I have been conducting these judgments all across the globe. There are many more prophets. There are many more people who I contacted all across our history that you do not know about. I mention these stories particularly because you already know about them. And hence we do actually find in our history evidence of people throughout our history, in every culture, who came with the claim that they have been contacted by the higher power, the maker. We call them sants, we call them shamans. We have so many names for them. Shehzad Bhai, I want to move forward to a very important point, that when it comes to taking guidance from the Quran, which was, this point actually helped me a lot. It's very important to know, if I want to take guidance from the Quran, that who is God talking to and why is he saying what he's saying? How important is it for me to know about a very basic biography of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? How important is it for me to have knowledge of the big milestones or big events in the life of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to know when I read the Quran that who is God talking to and why?
Well, you see, essentially, if I answer your question by saying that the Quran itself is the greatest biography of God's last messenger, because you see, the biography which the Quran speaks of is his biography as a messenger of God. As yet, to date, all the biographies which we find written by various authors, they speak of his ministry, his dawah, and his mission as a prophet of God, in which he is sent as a person who guides mankind. As far as the instrument of justice is concerned, which he was the last instrument of justice as a messenger of God, I think the greatest repository of this biography is the Quran itself. And the way it describes the ministry of the Prophet, it's his preaching mission, which we can maybe discuss in another instance, is that it divides the Quran in the phases of the Prophet's own preaching mission. There is a Meccan phase and there is a Medinan phase. And the whole of the Quran is divided into 7 chapters. And these 7 chapters, all of them have a very, very common feature, that each of these 7 chapters begin with a Meccan surah and end on a Medinan surah. And in each of these chapters, one or more than one phase of the Prophet's mission, either in Mecca or in Medina or in both, has been discussed. So that from wherever you pick up the Quran, if you have a knowledge of the fact that these are the 7 chapters and they begin from this surah, and the first chapter ends here, the second chapter begins from here, and so on and so forth, if you know this distinction of these 7 chapters of the Quran, and you pick up or you read any of the chapters, and you also know what exactly is the link between these chapters and why is it that these chapters are placed the way they are in the Quran that we find today, it's a huge revelation. And one literally, our soul, it's such a soulful thing. It's such a beautiful revelation to us that how the Almighty has preserved his divine judgment in these 7 chapters, and that too in a way that we can see through these seven chapters that the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as it progressed in the Meccan period and in the Medinan period, how it reaches culmination in that judgment. Now, if we have this theme of the Quran before us of being divided into 7 chapters, and each of these chapters being divided into various phases of the Prophet's own life vis-a-vis his preaching mission, you'll find that the history and hadith that we have today at our disposal, that we can fit those events under these phases of the Quran. And that would be, I think, something which would really, really communicate a lot to people who would like to understand more, because at times the Quran has a very principled stance. It's a very concise book. We don't have a lot of details. So if we can simply compile the Quran compile the history of the Prophet or the biography of the Prophet in such a way that his phases, the phases of his life, the phases of his mission as a messenger of God, we can earmark them first in the Quran, and then various incidents from outside the Quran, which are described in history or in hadith, after sifting them out, after evaluating their historical provenance and authenticity, we can just place them under those phases. We'll find a very comprehensive biography of the Quran, and which, to my knowledge, as yet has not ever been attempted.
Okay, I want to bring up here, when you talk about biographies, I want to bring up here the mention of so many prophets and messengers and their missions within the Quran. I want to talk about this because when a layman reads the Quran, like I did, I found certain things in the Quran to be very repetitive, and I did not understand why. And one of those repetitive things was the stories of these messengers, of these Rasuls in the Quran. So the Quran is also a preserved biography of Muhammad Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But Quran also brings up, Allah Ta'ala, God, brings up again and again stories of Rasuls, or should I say, the worldly demonstrations of God's judgment here on earth before Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Why does God so repetitively tell their stories, and why is that so important to repetitively tell the audiences these stories, vis-a-vis Muhammad Rasulullah being the last judgment of God on this earth for his adversaries?
Well, this is a very good and an interesting question. And the Quran has actually answered this question in a very generic way. It says that we have repeated the various verses of the Quran, and the term the Quran itself uses for that is tasrif, and in various styles and in various innovative ways, so that they can serve as guidance for various people of various temperaments. Now, I'd like to elaborate on this, and that is, you see, for example, if you take the story of Abraham, is, or the story of Moses, I would say, it is, I think, the most repeated story in the Quran. But for a general reader, I mean, if you just skim through it, you'll find a lot of repetition and you'll find something being said over and over again. But if you fine tune it and go a little more deep, you'll find that every single instance in which story of Moses is discussed, for example, there is some very subtle detail being added in that particular portion, which was not found in some of the previous portions. But the fact is that a general reading would not give you that conclusion. You need to go a little more deep. And for that, you also need to understand that this particular detail would be in match with the theme of a particular surah. So you see, as we just talked about the fact that the Quran is composed of 7 chapters, and within these chapters, the surah occur in pairs. This is another thing that I'd like to point out, that there are 7 chapters of the Quran. Within each chapter, the surahs occur in pair. Each surah has a theme. Each of these chapters begins with a Meccan surah, one or more Meccan surah, and ends with one or more than one Medinan surah. So if we are able to understand this, you'll relish the fact that this Quran is a book in which the biography of the Prophet is presented in a manner that it makes all these phases extremely distinct. And as a result, you'll find that the paired surahs, or the surahs in which the various branches or the various portions of the Prophet's life is concerned, they stand out in one way or the other. And the detail that you'll find, for example, being added to the story of Moses in some other surah would be in line with the theme of that surah, which would not be the theme of some other surah. So as I said, there are subtle additions, but for that needs some more depth, in-depth study. Otherwise, a general study would give you this impression, well, it's a mere repetition, whereas in fact it is not. I mean, it's a repetition for a person who would just quickly go over it. But for a person who would like to go in detail, there are subtle details, and those subtle details are added in line with the theme of the particular surah in which that incident is occurring.
Okay. Yeah. I think we're running out of time. We have just 12, 13 minutes left. Lastly, before we wrap this up, Shehzad, I want to talk about another very miraculous aspect of the Quran, and that is the language. we know that it was very easy for us today to maybe, and some critics of Islam actually do say that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, na'uzubillah, made the Quran up. Some even go to the extent of saying that there was probably some psychological issue with the Prophet, psychiatric issue with the Prophet, peace be upon him, na'uzubillah, and he was just hallucinating this whole thing. I think the language of the Quran is so miraculous that it negates both of these claims. Because when Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam claimed that he is being contacted by God from the other realm, that communication was not in the usual normal language. That communication was occurring in the best poetry that that language has ever seen. How important is it for and that I believe is the most miraculous part also of the Quran, the poetic aspect of it. But how important is it for the reader who is not an Arabic speaking reader? How important is it for them to know about the language of the Quran, about the way God has spoke? And how important is it to know that the translations of the Quran might not transfer that might and that beauty to the audiences that otherwise would be present if, let's say, I knew Quranic Arabic?
Well, I think 3 points can be made in this regard vis-a-vis a non-Arabic reader, a person who's, who would not appreciate the linguistic style of the Quran. Of course, people who are aware of Arabic, for them, it's a literary masterpiece. But since you have asked this question regarding people who are not conversant with Arabic, I think there are 3 points or 3 aspects that for them become decisive. One of them is that this is a book in which you'll find an authoritative person speaking, an authoritative being speaking, and which is the person of God. And the way he speaks, the authoritative manner in which he speaks, and the way he discusses issues is something which is beyond the scope of human endeavor or human writing. You'll seldom see the way the Almighty speaks, the way he presents an argument, the way he is reflected in a book, being reflected or being mentioned in some other books. So it's like a divine speech which is being presented in a way that has no other parallel. You'll not find, except in some of the other divine scriptures, like, for example, the Old or the New Testament. But other than that, the preserved divine speech is something which the style, if not, you're not able to appreciate it if you're a non-Arabic reader, but the way in which the Almighty presents his basic premise and the way he goes on commenting on certain things and the way the worldview it gives is simply beyond human approach, I would say. The second point is the aspect which the Quran itself says, and that is that it is free of any discrepancies. It is free of any evolution. There is nothing which, has changed in the Quran, which is, of course, is a very significant trait of every human book. You'll find every human author, however great he might be, he could be a Kant, he could be a Newton, he could be an Einstein, he could be a Plato or an Aristotle, but all of these geniuses, they passed through various changes in their life. They had a certain idea or a view, and they kept changing and evolving from that. And ultimately, even in their final years, we find scholars forsaking a lot of things that they said earlier on, and they said, well, just write it off from me, and now I no longer subscribe to such and such an opinion. So the Quran is beyond any such evolutionary, I would say, development. Whatever it said on day number 1, it persisted with that at the end as well. So there is nothing of any sort that you can call a discrepancy or something which has changed in its view or its stance or its style. And the third thing I would say is that it's a timeless book. There are books who fade away after 50 years, after 100 years. They don't stand to the test of time simply because the information that they mention becomes redundant or it becomes revised, or because the way they address certain issues, those issues die down and newer issues replace them. The Quran is a book which has stood the testimony and stood the test of time. The issues which it discusses, of course, are issues which are still living. They are still relevant to every single human being. And at the same time, the information which it divulges, for example, regarding certain aspects of science, let it be biological science or astronomical science or even certain other areas, is still accurate. And it is accurate as it could have been. But the fact is that no one could have imagined that for a book 14 centuries ago that it could present these facts with such precision when mankind was not even aware of these scientific facts. So I would say the third aspect is for a non-Arabic reader that the facts which it presents and the information which it presents has stood up to the test of time. It's a timeless book. It's an ageless book. It cannot, lose its relevance. And finally, because of the fact that the greatest trait of the Quran is that it informs mankind of what is going to happen once we die. So therefore, it can never become irrelevant, because death is something which is associated with each and every one of us, and each and every one of us is going to face our destiny one day. And the Quran informs us about that destiny. It tells us what will happen when we die. And therefore, this relevance is something, whatever may happen, can never cease. And I would say that these are some of the features for a non-Arabic reader which still continue to bedazzle him, continue to cause awe in his heart or in her heart, because yes, this is a book which speaks like as if some divine orator, someone beyond this world is speaking. He's speaking about certain things which we have no knowledge of. And the way he's speaking all these things are as if they are definitive and there is absolutely no change. And what was said on day number one was adhered to right till the end.
Wonderfully cleared, Shehzad Bhai. Would it be accurate to say that for a non-Arabic speaking person who reads the Quran or a translation of the Quran, although it would be impossible for him to grasp the poetic beauty and finesse of the words or the language that God used, but they can fully understand and comprehend the guidance or the basic muqaddimah or the basic case of the Quran, that there is no problem in that?
Absolutely. You see, that is one of the finesse or the finer points of the Quran, the subtle aspects of the Quran. You see, the Quran is a book which addresses every single person. And as far as the guidance aspect is concerned, it is something which can be gauged and understood by every single person. But the subtle points can only be appreciated by scholars or maybe who are deep thinkers. But then they don't add to any guidance which the common man would lack. What they do is they present some further evidence, some more subtle things, which appeals to subtle minds. So you see, because of the fact that the Almighty has created this world in a way that people have different levels of intelligence, different levels of comprehension. So these subtle points are basically meant to appeal to such people who have that, who have the brains to appreciate those subtle points. For the common man, if they miss out these subtle points, they would not lose upon any guidance or some basic aspect of the Quran. So it is precisely for this reason, I think, that the Quran itself has said that it is hudal lin-nas, which means it is guidance for mankind. Every single person can receive guidance from it. So yes, for the common man, even if those subtle points, those linguistic details, those finesse, the finesse found in its sentence structure, if they are not able to appreciate it, but the guidance which they need to salvage them, to earn them salvation in the hereafter, is something which even a simple translation of the Quran would suffice.
Perfect. So that's how a divine book should be. It should cater to the needs of both an ordinary person, right, and it should cater to the needs of somebody who wants to dive in the ocean of knowledge and scholarship. Lastly, Shehzad Bhai, I want to present in front of you an analogy, because I consider myself to be a complete layman, and someone gave me this analogy which helped me in understanding the Quran, and I want you to comment on it before we wrap it up. For somebody who wants to read the Quran, consider the following analogy, that imagine, complete analogy, fictional. Imagine if Alexander the Great was doing his conquests on the guidance of a Macedonian king, for example. And the Macedonian king was sending him letters and guiding him on exactly what to do, when to do, and how to do. Later on, imagine if Alexander the Great saved all of those letters and compiled it in the form of a book and gave it to his followers, so that anybody in future could exactly see how the Macedonian king conducted affairs through Alexander. Now, if I want to see what the Macedonian king thought about a certain matter, I will go into this book. I will see where exactly and how many times that Macedonian king has talked about that matter. Let's say something as mundane as cleanliness of soldiers, right? I would go into that book, see wherever the Macedonian king has mentioned about the cleanliness of soldiers and what he has said to make up my mind on what the Macedonian king thought about cleanliness of soldiers. Is that would be an accurate analogy about the Quran, Shehzad Bhai, and how should one go about reading it?
Well, I think that it's slightly an oversimplification because you see, what happens is that in the case of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the previous messengers, there is a specific theme and there is a specific purpose for which the Quran was revealed. And that presupposes the fact that, 70 to 80% of your own guidance that you need is inbuilt in you. And it's only where you might forget that guidance or where you might not be able to reach that guidance that does, so to speak, God would send those letters to his messenger, if you take the example of Alexander and the Macedonians. But as I said, for them, a very large part would be something which they don't require guidance, because you see, this is something which is inbuilt in them. Yes, in the remaining part, if those letters guide them regarding a certain expedition or a certain journey, it would be invaluable guidance. But another thing is that in the Quran, as you see, that this guidance is preserved in a very specific sequence. It's not preserved in its historical sequence or the chronological sequence. For example, if that had been the case, we would find all the Meccan surahs first and then the Medinan surahs. Whereas we find that Surah Fatiha, which is the first surah, immediately after it is Surah Baqarah, which is a very long Medinan surah. So you see, the arrangement of those letters, so to speak, is in a very specific way, and it constitutes a very cogent arrangement in which the Almighty is trying to communicate his view or his worldview.
We could say the Macedonian king himself arranged the letters in the form of a book.
Yeah, in that case, yes. If he himself arranged it in the form of a book so that he could give that meaningful guidance for the rest of the people, well, this is how we are going to, you can conduct a campaign or a fight or a war in this way, and this is the guidance that you can contemplate. Yes, then of course that could be in a certain way, yes. But I would still say that, it would still be perhaps an oversimplification, and also perhaps we need to suppose a lot of things that, well, this would have happened, and this is a supposition that we already agree to. But I would say, yes, if you would like to explain it to a person or a student
I intentionally meant to oversimplify it, because that's what I think some of us need. I needed a very oversimplified version of what Quran is, and that's what I found helpful, that it's a collection of the spoken word of God, arranged by God himself in the final form of a book. Again, that's a misconception that it's been arranged by Hazrat Usman or the companions of the Prophet. We'll talk about that in the misconceptions part. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I hope that today we have been able to shed some light as much as we could in 1 hour about what kind of a book is the Quran, factual introduction of the Quran, and how can one go about reading it to get the guidance that it's meant to give, guidance for all mankind for the day of judgment to come. I hope we were able to shed some light on it. Thank you so much, Shehzad Bhai. And inshallah, in the next episode, we will be talking about, in a very summarized way, the basic teachings of the Quran and why do they make ethical, moral, and rational sense. Thank you so much for your time, and inshallah, see you in the next episode. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam. Inshallah, we'll do that.